Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel presentation, Dungeness Crab in the Salish Sea, a case study in collaborative research for a sustainable fishing future. And happy solstice to everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I will speak slowly so that people who are just arriving a little bit late will have the most chance to hear from our panelists. But to get us started, I just would like to remind everyone that tonight's program is paired with tomorrow's live light trap demonstration at Fort Worden State Park on the pier at 9:30 in the morning. If you haven't registered for that and you're interested in attending, you can still do that online, I believe. And we'll do our best to get some photos of it if you're not there and would like to see what the live light trap is all about. If you aren't familiar with it, you will certainly know more about it by the time tonight's presentation is complete. To begin, I'm Diane Quinn. I'm the program director for the Port Townsend Marine Science Center. I'd like to acknowledge that we at the Marine Science Center work on the traditional lands of many Coast Salish peoples, particularly the Sklallam people, the Strong people. We respect and are grateful for this land and these waters and the people who have inhabited them since time immemorial and who continue to steward this place for future generations. Our program tonight is the third in a series that began last October, in which the Jefferson County Marine Resources Committee and the Port Townsend Marine Science Center partnered to bring fresh information out to our community in a kind of a different format, a combination of a talk paired with some type of a live event that people could participate in. I want to thank our MRC partners, in particular, Monica Montgomery and Brenda Johnson, for making this possible, and Betsy Carlson, who is the Citizen Science Coordinator at the Port Townsend Marine Science Center and serves on the Jefferson County MRC. As I said, the series was conceived of as a way to pair and bring together science and practice. Maybe thinking about it as a way to help us see how science informs practice, but also the role that practitioners play in defining the questions that need to be answered and often the methods for answering those questions. And I think tonight's panel is kind of the perfect representation of this idea. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to tell you all, because I'm thinking that most of you are in the room now, we're going to keep video and microphones off for everybody but the presenters, and suggest you be in speaker view, as the slide is saying. We're going to use the Q&A as a place for you to put questions throughout the presentation rather than the chat. You can chat in the chat, but if you would keep the Q&A as a place for questions, that'll make my life so much easier at the end when we reserve some time for passing your questions over to our panelists. And so thank you for doing it that way for me. We're not going to record the Q&A, but we will record the rest of the session. And we do have some questions that we'd like to ask all of you to answer to help us see how we're doing at the end of the program tonight. Our panelists, first of all, I just want to thank all of them for being here. This is kind of a magical configuration of people to have on a Tuesday evening. And so we're very happy to get to host this program and really appreciate them being here. Emily Buckner is the program coordinator for the Pacific Northwest Crab Research Group, which is under the auspices of the Puget Sound Restoration Fund. So she works with all of the partners involved in this project. Dr. Caitlin Bosley is the Puget Sound crustacean biologist for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Dr. Liz Tobin is the Shellfish program manager for the Jamestown Sklallam tribe. And I want to thank all of them for being here, and I'm going to turn the program over now to Emily Buckner.
Thanks so much, Diane. All right, give me 1 second to share my screen. Make sure I do the right thing here. All right, can everyone see this slide all right, my title slide? Okay, awesome. Well, thanks so much, Diane, for that wonderful introduction and for inviting us to speak tonight. Good evening, everyone. Happy solstice, as was said before. We're really excited to be giving this presentation, hopefully timely, as the recreational fishery for crab does start on July 1st. So hopefully people are getting excited, and this presentation will help feel even more excited about crab and learning a lot about the fishery and the species. So as Diane said, my name is Emily Buckner. I work for Puget Sound Restoration Fund as a biologist and a project manager, and I have the great privilege of serving as the program coordinator for the Pacific Northwest Crab Research Group, which you'll hear us refer to as PCRG primarily, and which will be one of the main topics of tonight. And I'm really excited to be joined by two of the two leaders of the group, some of the founders of the group, Dr. Caitlin Bosley and Dr. Liz Tobin, and I'll let them introduce themselves really quickly. So Caitlin, maybe you want to start, and then Liz.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yeah, sounds great.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for inviting me to join your event today. My name is Caitlin Bosley. I'm the lead Puget Sound crustacean biologist with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. My role with the agency is to oversee management activities of state recreational and commercial crab and shrimp fisheries. I supervise a team of biologists and technicians that engage in fishery monitoring, surveys, and research. And I serve as the primary technical advisor for the co-management of Puget Sound crab and shrimp resources in the state of Washington.
Okay, great. Can everyone hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Tobin. I go by Liz. I am the Shellfish program manager with the Jamestown tribe, excuse me. My role with the tribe is to basically provide treaty harvest opportunity for Jamestown's tribal citizens. And in my role, I serve as a co-manager with the state, specifically with Caitlin. And I co-manage various different shellfish resources. Today, primarily, we're talking about crab, and we'll get in a little bit more into what co-management actually entails in this presentation.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks, Liz. All right, so let's see if I can advance my slide here. So tonight, as the reason why you're all here, of course, is because you want to hear about the iconic Dungeness crab. Which is a large crustacean species that lives in coastal waters from Alaska down to Baja. And throughout their range, they serve as a really important role, both within the ecosystem, but also for human communities, where they have this high economic value, both because of the commercial and recreational fisheries, but also a high cultural value. And this is where, if we were all in person, I would ask folks to raise their hand if they to say if they have gone crabbing before, perhaps if they've made a similar face to a decade younger me when catching their own Dungeness crab. So that's kind of what we're here today, and we hope that's kind of why you all are excited to be here as well. So for tonight's presentation, we're going to split it into 3 parts. First, I'll provide some background on the natural history of Dungeness crab, highlighting what we know and what we don't know about the species, particularly within the Salish Sea. In part 2, Caitlin and Liz are going to share how the Washington crab fishery is co-managed between the state and treaty tribes, how the PCRG, or the Pacific Northwest Crab Research Group, formed, and the collaborative group's mission and goals. And finally, in part 3, it'll jump back to me, and I'm going to introduce what new research our group is working on, highlighting the Larval Crab Monitoring Network specifically, which folks, as Diane said, folks will have the opportunity to engage with tomorrow morning in kind of the field trip component of this speaker series, and we'll talk about again at the end. So that's our plan for this evening. So let's start by looking at the Dungeness crab's life cycle. So most folks are going to be familiar with the adult stage, but crabs, like many other marine invertebrates, have several different developmental stages where they assume fairly different physiological forms and occupy distinct habitats. So in the case of Dungeness, sexually mature females, which are usually about 2 years and older, mate with males and produce between 1.5 to 2.5 million eggs, which hatch between the winter and spring months. Once they hatch, baby crabs begin their lives in the marine environment as planktonic larvae, or called zoea, and they can spend nearly 4 months in the water column in that form. So in late spring and through the summer, larval crabs then transition to their megalopal stage, where they can actively, as this image shows, actively swim and migrate between deeper waters during the day and surface waters at night for just a few weeks before they move into the nearshore environment and settle to the benthos in their juvenile stage and begin their lives as ocean bottom dwellers that we're so familiar with. You can kind of see them, here they are growing in this little graphic here in the nearshore environment. See, my slide is pausing. There we go. There we go, sorry. Weird animations. So here's just another photo to show the different states, with the megalopal stage here at the top, followed by the juvenile or what's called the instar stage. And juvenile crab grow fairly rapidly and have to molt quite frequently and kind of in order to keep up. Molting is when they shed their hard exoskeleton, which they can do every 15 to 50 days when they're growing at this point. And then post shedding that hard exoskeleton, they reharden their new larger shell. And each of these molts is counted as an instar stage, of which there are roughly about 13 of them. So it's at this point in the life history of Dungeness crab, this juvenile stage, where we know how critical the selection of appropriate habitat is. Individuals that settle in more structurally complex habitats, such as eelgrass or oyster shells, are more likely to survive through their juvenile stage into adulthood. And this is because these more complex habitats have more kind of nooks and crannies for small crabs to hide in and evade predators such as sculpin. So what this graph is showing is the proportion of Dungeness crab consumed by sculpin. And you can see that that percentage drops off quite quickly in the fish that are looking for crab in these more complex habitat. So juveniles spend 6 to 12 months in these protective habitats before migrating to deeper habitats, which they then occupy for the rest of their adult lives, in which we usually find them when we're crabbing. And as adults, Dungeness crab are really opportunistic feeders, eating bivalves, fishes, shrimp, and other crabs, including other Dungeness crabs sometimes. They have really few predators as adults other than humans, though wolf eels, octopuses, sea otters, and really large fish such as lingcod and cabezon might also eat them. However, remember back to that previous slide, in earlier life stages, they're actually the favorite prey of many other species. So as those juvenile instars, these small demersal fishes such as sculpin do like to feed on them. And in their zoea and even their earlier zoea or megalopy stage, they're really the favorite prey item of many forage fish and salmon smolts. So from what I've just said, clearly a lot is known about Dungeness crab, but there are also many things that we don't know, particularly regarding our local crab in the Salish Sea. And so now I'm going to turn to a couple of the big question marks that we have about our local crab populations. So one of the biggest questions regarding our local crab populations can be really boiled down to, where do crab come from and where do they go? And the reason that this is such a hard question to answer is to remember that when crab hatch, they spend several months in that planktonic stage, being carried by currents until they settle to the sea floor. And as this model of nearshore surface water movement demonstrates, crab larvae could be carried a great distance from where their parents were over the course of several months and end up in a very different place. So again, that question, where do they come from and where do they go, is actually a somewhat hard question to know. Another large area of questioning is that of where in their life history Dungeness crab are the most vulnerable to environmental influences, like in a changing ocean. So conditions such as water temperature, acidic water, so a low pH, and then oxygen levels, all very likely, and we know they impact this species. But at what point in their development and to what degree is not fully understood. So by better understanding the response of this species at its different stages to these types of stressors, we could hopefully predict their response as a population and as a species to a changing ocean into the future. So by wrapping, that was a very kind of quick overview of Dungeness crab life history. But by wrapping up part one on what we do and don't know about Dungeness crab, and I want to now transition into part two, discussing how the fishery is managed. And as Liz and Caitlin kind of present this information, I like to have you hold this question in your mind of why is it important to understand Dungeness crab biology and ecology, the stuff I was just talking about, for fisheries management. So I'll now turn things over to Caitlin and Liz to talk about this more. If Liz can unmute. There we go.
Okay, sorry, I was waiting for my slide cue.
Next slide.
Next slide, please. So before we really dive into what we do as fisheries managers, I think we need to kind of take a step back, have a little bit of history, a lesson here to really understand what is the history of cooperative management in Washington State shell fishery. And to understand this, we need to go back to the 1950s when the territory governor Isaac Stevens had negotiated 5 treaties with the indigenous people that make up Western Washington tribes. And so 5 treaties of looking for the tribes to surrender their land to provide basically opportunity for new incoming homesteaders, or as they might be referred to as white settlers. One of these treaties was the Treaty of Point No Point, which was signed by the original inhabitants of the northern Kitsap and Olympic Peninsula. This included the S'Klallam, Klallam, and the Chimacum and the Skokomish tribes. And when Stevens was negotiating with tribal leaders, he recognized that they had a very deep dependency on being able to harvest natural resources from the land and waters around them. So they knew that they were not going to be able to get tribal leaders to basically agree to pick up and move, to give up their lands and to move to these smaller reservations if they didn't reserve the right for the tribes to be able to harvest fish. So all of the Stevens treaties included what we call kind of the fish proviso, and it had this very specific language which stated, the right of taking fish at usual and accustomed grounds and stations is further secured to said Indians in common with citizens of the territory, provided, however, that they shall not take shellfish from any beds staked or cultivated by the citizens. So this was the agreement and the rights that were reserved to the tribes upon signing of the treaties in 1850. Next slide. So fast forward to the 1960s, and basically the tribes were very severely restricted in their right to harvest fish. And these restrictions occurred through state fishing regulations at the time. This was a period that's often referred to as the Fish Wars, and that's because the tribes of Western Washington, literally in some cases, had to battle for recognition of their treaty rights. So because the treaties are defined as the supreme law of the land, eventually the tribes actually sought federal assistance to confirm their fishing rights and to basically have the federal government uphold their trust responsibility to the tribes. So the case that was brought before federal court in 1974 is known as U.S. versus Washington, also referred to commonly as the Bolt decision. It was the ruling of this case where the federal court basically reaffirmed the tribe's treaty rights. And not only did that, but they recognized the tribes as co-managers with the state of Washington with an equal right to harvest, equal meaning 50%. The Bolt decision was largely focused on finfish and most notably salmon. And then 20 years later, the federal judge, Rafiti, basically made the same ruling as it applied to shellfish resources. So these are two kind of landmark cases. And I always like to read this quote that came out of the Rafiti decision, that a treaty is not a grant of rights to the Indians, but a grant of rights from them. So this really, these two landmark cases really set the stage for cooperative management in Washington state. Next slide, please. And another thing that came out of these court cases was a federal court directive. And as it applies to shellfish resources, it's referred to as the Shellfish Implementation Plan. And this plan basically provides the essential framework, the principles of co-management, and the course of action that needs to be taken for cooperative management of shellfish resources. Specifically, it identifies kind of what 50% is. So states that each tribe may take from natural beds up to 50% of the sustainable harvest of biomass of any shellfish species within the usual and accustomed areas for that tribe. And so this is where it gets a bit complicated, because not every tribe actually shares the same, what we call UNA. You'll hear us refer to it as UNA, but they don't share the same usual and accustomed areas. So in the image shown here on the slide, this is showing the very broad UNA of the no point treaty area as it applies to the Slalom and Clallam tribes. You can see that this is a very broad area in which they have UNA, and some of the different regions overlap with other tribes. So for example, there's going to be a different tribes that have overlapping UNA in the islands versus those that have them in the straits versus those that have UNA down in Hood Canal. So as you can probably start to piece together, this can make management very, very complex because in every different region of Puget Sound, you have different management, basically voices at the table. So the other thing that came out of the Shellfish Implementation Plan is that any harvest, whether it be tribal or non-tribal, from public lands and waters has to take place in accordance to management agreements that are developed on an annual basis between the tribes and the state. So these management agreements have to be in place before any harvest can occur. So next slide. So the big question is, what does 50-50 sharing actually look like? And it's really a pretty simple concept here. So the chart that we're going to show shows kind of the relative contribution of each fishery. So the co-managers will get together, and within their management plans, they will determine what is considered to be the sustainable amount of harvest, or more simply, the total quota for an area. So that total quota is then split 50-50, and 50% of that quota goes to the tribes and 50% goes to the state. And the tribes cooperatively manage their 50% share, and the state manages internally its 50% share. And there's different ways in which the share can be managed. So for the tribes, or we'll start with the state, animation. So start with the state, they will allocate a certain proportion of their share to state commercial harvest and a proportion to state recreational harvest. And quite similarly for the tribes, they will allocate a proportion to tribal commercial harvest and allocate proportion of that share to tribal subsistence harvest. Okay, next slide. So the Dungeness crab fishery is, as Emily was mentioning earlier, it is a vital fishery to both the states and the tribes. I'd like to point out in this graph here that since the Rafiti decision that occurred in 1994, you can see almost immediately after that, the state and the tribal 50-50 sharing started taking place, where the co-managers worked together. They would determine what the allowable harvest was, and you can see very clearly in this figure that almost perfectly 50% is harvested by the state and the tribes. So the Puget Sound crab fishery is managed separately from the coastal fishery. And the Puget Sound crab fishery accounts for about 45% of the total harvest of the Washington's crab fishery. And then in 2019, 2020, the overall value of just the Puget Sound fishery alone was about $3.4 million. So this is a huge source of revenue, both to tribal and non-tribal citizens. And of course, there's inherent cultural value in Dungeness crab. So next slide. Okay, so who are the Puget Sound co-managers? Well, there's a lot of us when it comes right down to it. And so on the state side of things, 4 different state agencies are involved in shellfish management. That includes Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Health, and the state parks. And on the tribal side, there are 14 Western Washington tribes that can be involved depending on what area they reside in these different fisheries, and they're all listed there. I won't go through them all. But these co-managers every year have to get together, and through their annual harvest management agreements, they have to basically stipulate what the allowable harvest is going to be. They need to cooperatively determine any conservation measures that are put into place. We have to identify what our harvest strategies are going to be, what our harvest seasons are going to be. And we have to make all these decisions. They have to be biologically based. They have to be kind of science and information driven. And we do this all in ensuring that there's going to be a sustainable resource. We're going to have not only crab now and provide opportunity now, but we're going to be providing that opportunity in the future. And working on the tribal side of things, we always say we're looking 7 generations ahead. Will there be opportunity and resource available 7 generations into the future? So just kind of highlighting the photos here, it says state and tribal biologists. As you can see, that's Caitlin and myself working out in the field to collect the biological information that we need so that when we're sitting around the table with the co-managers, we are making data-driven and biologically driven decisions. So with that said, I'll pass it on to Caitlin to talk a little bit more in detail about crab resource management.
Thanks, Liz. Great introduction for this next section here. So talking a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of the Puget Sound crab fishery management. So the cooperative co-management of Dungeness crab in Puget Sound takes place throughout the whole sound here, but it takes place in discrete spatial management units. We have 7 overall management regions that are shown here. Some of those management regions have sub-regions, like for instance, 3, we have the 3-1, 3-3, those are different sub-regions and 2s. And within each one of those management regions, we have the agreed to, where the agreed to management procedures are enacted. So each year prior to the fishery, the co-managers come together and we work for each region to reach agreement on the rules and regulations that will govern the fishery for that year, but also set the initial quota that defines what the allowable harvest level will be. And as Liz mentioned, our goal is to set the quotas that are at a reasonable level that ensures the sustainability of the resource and a predictability for the harvest for the future, for the next year. Yep, I think we can go to the next slide. All right, the primary mechanism that we use to protect the resource is through application of the 3S management system. And this form of management was first applied to Dungeness crab fisheries along the West Coast as early as the 1940s and has been the gold standard for crab management since that time. The management concept is relatively simple. So the first S is the sex, and that restricts the harvest to only males. So allowing retention of only males, and then the females need to remain in the population to reproduce and contribute to the reproductive potential of the stock. The next S is the size. And so that sets a minimum harvest size for the males that are retained, and allowing the males only greater than a defined size ensures that they have a minimum of 1 to 2 years to reproduce before they get removed from the population, thus contributing to the reproductive potential of the stock. So in Puget Sound, the legal size limit for Dungeness crab males is 6 1/4, but other states and other areas have different minimum size limits. So I think that's important to remember. And then the next S, the third S, is season. And so this establishes a season, a harvest season that avoids the vulnerable life history phase of like when they're molting, when the crab are soft shell, and it limits the handling mortality and protects the resource. So overall, the underlying principle here is that we're taking out only male crab over a specific size that have had a chance to reproduce a minimum of 1 to 2 times, and that these individuals, these males, represent a surplus and that can be removed from the population without impacting the resource. Yep, I think that is the next one. Okay, so the success of the 3S management strategy is really based on preserving that reproduction potential that I mentioned. And that requires a knowledge of the biology of the crab. And so the 3S management system is structured around these very kind of simple facts that we know about crab. One is that the animals are molting. They're molting every year until they get to, a very large size, greater than 5 inches in carapace width. We have the fishery closed during the peak molting period. We believe the peak molting period to take place in the spring. At least that's the area that period of time that we avoid in Puget Sound. We don't allow fisheries to take place during that time to limit any handling of the vulnerable soft shell crab. We know that mating occurs immediately after the female molts. So again, a reason for not allowing harvest during that period of time. Females can store sperm for up to 2 years after they mate. So even if they go through a season without having the opportunity to reproduce, they still may have sperm stored and are able to produce broods of eggs, maybe up to 1 or 2 years after a mating event. And then they're holding their eggs in November through January. You can see this picture here shows, well, you can see a soft shell crab on the top, and on the bottom is a female that has a brood of eggs on its abdomen there. And you may have seen those in the past if you do winter crabbing. And then, so then the eggs will be hatching in the early spring. And then they go into the plankton as zoea, megalope, and then recruit again around this time of year. And then we also know that the adults, we live to be 8 to 10 years old based on some literature. Okay, so Puget Sound management is complex, and the Puget Sound ecosystem is very complex. It's a complex estuarine system with unique dynamics, and we as co-managers, and with Liz and I together, have been noticing and observing changes in the crab populations that have really led us to wonder whether or not the 3S management strategy is fully appropriate for our populations in Puget Sound. Some of the questions that come to mind are, is that size limit appropriate? We said that 6 1/4 is what the limit is in Puget Sound. Is that the appropriate size limit? What about the seasonal closure periods? I said in Puget Sound, we tend to not allow fishing during the spring period. That's when we think that the peak molt is happening, but there's evidence that suggests that that might be happening at different places and different times. Is that the appropriate seasonal closure? What about changing environmental conditions? How is fishing pressure affecting when molting is happening or where mating is happening? Ultimately, does this 3S management strategy make sense? And then also, as co-managers, we're tasked with apportioning the harvestable surplus biomass equally between the tribes and the state. We don't really know what that is. How do we know what the harvestable surplus is? Are we taking the full surplus? Can we take more? Are we taking more than we should? We don't really know. And so in many other fisheries, they employ stock assessments as a tool to help derive what a surplus production would be and to guide management actions of how much we can take to help define what a quota should be, what a reasonable harvest level should be. So we don't have that tool, and we don't really have the information that we need to develop that tool. Next slide. So in response to this increasing number of questions and need for data to inform management, a research consortium was formed sort of organically from co-managers and interested parties wanting to understand more about this resource. So that we've bound together and formed the Pacific Northwest Crab Research Group. And this group really kind of started to take shape in December of 2018. So this slide here shows a number of the different parties that are partners that participate and contribute to many different groups. And I think Emily's going to go into a little more details about the structure of the group. And right now we're an informal network of scientists, managers, and community members. We represent tribes, state and federal agencies, and educational institutions, industry now we have involved to really kind of start to pursue the answers to some of these questions that will help us, Liz and I, when we're sitting around the table, deriving management plans, trying to make data-informed decisions. This group and this group of people are really helping us, forge that way forward. So from here, I'll let Emily take it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Caitlin, Liz. This is an awesome summary, and definitely just want to let the audience know that I am always in awe of these two. They have a very hard and they're really good at their jobs. So it's cool to work with them, and I'm so glad they're able to come today. So as Caitlin just really well kind of articulated how the group formed. Again, this slide kind of just shows a fraction of the partners. We have over 50 partners, over 100 members who contribute to this group, this informal network. And as I had noted at the beginning, I work for the Puget Sound Restoration Fund, which is a 501c3 nonprofit who coordinates. So we coordinate that organization coordinates the network. So I'll just skip ahead and really quickly note. So, the mission, this group of folks came together with this mission of promoting and supporting sustainable Dungeness crab populations in the Pacific Northwest. And we were working to fulfill that mission by addressing data gaps through strategic research and tailoring that research to inform and support fisheries managers like Caitlin and Liz. So how does the group determine what research topics to pursue? So during the first couple kind of all group meetings in 2019 and 2020, meeting participants identified first Dungeness crab knowledge gaps, which have been kind of noted, we've noted in this presentation already, and also management priorities, which we've also been noting. And this input was documented and incorporated into a research guide, which is available on our website if folks want to read more in depth after this presentation. So as this kind of simple flowchart shows, PCRG works to prioritize conducting research that fills important knowledge gaps and addresses managers' needs. So from this whole research prioritization process, the question of what is the best predictor of adult crab abundance in Washington state really rose to the top of what folks felt like needed to be addressed first by the group. So what we're hoping to discover here in Washington is what was shown by Shanks et al. At the University of Oregon, which is that the abundance of megalopy can potentially predict adult crab abundance 4 years later. So with that kind of background in the literature and other academics in mind, what we've done as our first major research project has been to develop this region-wide larval crab survey to generate estimates of megalopy abundance, with the hope that this information can be used by managers to better understand the number of harvestable adult crab in this region. So in designing our study, we knew, as has been said earlier, that Dungeness crab megalopy can be found in peak abundances in the near shore of the Salish Sea in the spring and summer months. And we also know, as this really cool video shows, that megalopy are extremely attracted to light. This is a trait called positive phototaxis. So in taking those kind of two things we knew together, oops, let's see if I can advance. We're using a device called a light trap to attract and catch Dungeness crab megalopi. So these pretty simple looking instruments are hung off docks and piers from April to September, with LED lights in the center turning on at sunset and off at sunrise. And those hours in between where the light is on is what we call our fishing hours. And very simply what happens is that water and organisms are attracted and flow into the funnels along the sides, and then the water filters out through the cod end. And everything that remains in the bottom there is our sample. And we go out and collect those samples every other day and count the number of Dungeness larvae caught before releasing them. And if you want to see more about this, we have a whole video outlining detailing our methods and kind of can walk you through the process, or you can come see our live demonstration tomorrow morning. So light trap station, we have light trap stations deployed across Washington waters, and actually this year also up into British Columbia. And as we're collecting these data, we hope to answer some very specific questions with them, which includes: when is peak larval abundance occurring? Where do larval pulses happen? And what is the relative abundance of larvae across sites? So remember those questions of where do the crab come from and where do they go? We're trying to get a sense of that with these light trap stations. So I'm going to show you an example of the data coming from this network, and keep those questions in mind. So this is showing 3 years of our monitoring data. And with that data, we can create these maps of our region showing larval crab abundance. So just to walk you through this kind of complicated graphic for a moment. So the columns are going to show the months that sampling occurred, and the rows are 3 different sampling years. And on this, it's a map of, as you can tell, a map of Puget Sound in each of these spots here. And the dots are representing crab larvae that were caught. And the size of the dot represents kind of the number of crab larvae, again, caught in that month. So you can see the bigger the dot, the more crab were caught at that site. So think about those questions from the previous slide. What we notice is, from looking at these data, is that peak abundance, so when you see kind of the biggest dots each year, those occur mostly in June, is when we see the biggest dots happening. But that while we see kind of the north generally observes more crab larvae, so the dots are a little bit bigger in the north than in the south, we do actually see crab larvae at all of our sites. So we do see an orange dot at every site at some point during the year sampling occurred. So several years of data, the power of putting several years of data together shows both that pattern of abundance, but also kind of shows the variation every year. So if we zoom in and kind of compare June of 2019 with June of 2021, we see a huge difference in the size of those dots, so the number of crab larvae caught. And remember that we are using the same device to catch crabs in both of those years. And in 2021, just those light traps caught significantly more crab, like orders of magnitude more crab than in 2019. So this just indicates to us that there was just a lot more crab in the water that year, likely. So that's kind of an interesting, this is what our data can kind of show us, and can start seeing these patterns emerge. So I'm going to now step back from kind of looking at the data, just thinking again broadly, what is this study teaching us? And we're in our 4th year now of monitoring. So what are we learning? We're learning that larval supply to various management areas. Remember the map that Caitlin and Liz showed earlier of how the fisheries management zones are broken up. So we know by having light traps all across Puget Sound that larvae come into management areas in a very kind of variation across space and through time. Not all these management zones are getting the same number of crab larvae. We're also observing that larval abundance does really decline moving from northern to southern Puget Sound, with our highest numbers of crab larvae being seen in the Straits and in the Whidbey and Admiralty, this area, Admiralty Inlet and the San Juan Island area, and our lowest numbers occurring in South Sound, South Hood Canal. We're also observing that there seem to be two distinct cohorts of Dungeness crab coming into our traps, and we can kind of tell that from slight differences in sizes and timing. So that maybe hints to us that there are potentially different populations that reproduce at slightly different times, but a lot of questions there to be explored. And then finally, a very kind of a specific observation, but one that was surprising to everyone, is that larvae have been observed in Southern Hood Canal before any other inland site each spring. And that's just kind of been a fun realization in the couple of years that we've been doing this. I also just wanted to finally touch upon the fact that there's beyond kind of the research and the applied data that we're collecting is a great opportunity for community engagement. So many of our sites work with community science volunteers to collect this data. The Port Townsend Marine Science Center, actually most of the data is being collected by volunteers. And it's also, these light traps are a great way to engage grade school through graduate level students. We see grade school students who use these light traps as a way to learn about Puget Sound ecology, maybe learn about electrical engineering if they're building the light traps, helping us build these light traps, and also just getting really important and helpful kind of hands-on field science experience. And then of course, at the graduate level, we have students who are able to kind of leverage the light trap network and the data we're collecting to ask new questions that all contribute to this kind of body of knowledge that we share within the network and increase our understanding of the species. So I'm actually going to cut us off here because I really want to make sure we have time for a couple questions and that we answer the things that you all are interested in. So I just want to say a huge thank you to those who came tonight and for your attention, and we'll look forward to your questions and answering those. The last plug I'll just say here is for learning more information, please visit our website, pnwcrab.com. There's lots of things that you can read about there. And then you can, of course, get in touch with me, and I can help get you in touch with other people at the Gmail account there. And I'm not a great social media person, but we do have a Twitter account that I sometimes post fun pictures and videos on. So if you are into Twitter, you can check that out too.